Alrighty, y'all. So, as I was telling the students here, it's kind of weird. I know I'm making a video of a video, but what the hope is by me pausing it and talking about it. And I have a handout here that I'm going to give those of you not here today on Monday. I'll also post it as a PDF in case you want to get started earlier on it that you guys can fill out, and I will add some stuff. I have some great PowerPoints I've made on civil rights over the years, but we're kind of running out of time, and I want to really try to get the most I possibly can. This video will run about 25 minutes, but I'll probably yak at least for 10 or 15 others of it. And it'll take us through not just African American civil rights, which is what you're most likely to be asked about, but also it'll talk about women and their movement. It'll talk about Hispanic Americans and their movement, and even the Americans with disabilities. It'll talk about Native Americans movement. And the hope is to give you guys some things that you can use, and maybe even some stuff you can use to get that complexity point when you do comparisons and stuff across different times and across different issues. All righty, so let's go ahead and start this. The first question's a lot of this is gonna be some stuff you remember, but it's important to know the basics, like what the Jim Crow laws were. That's the first thing they're gonna be asking about.
On July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, which charted a bold course for the new nation of the United States and declared that all men are created equal. Many Americans have struggled to make that promise a reality. In the latter half of the 20th century, many groups, including women, Hispanics, Asians, Native Americans, and the physically challenged, fought for equal rights. But it was the African American civil rights movement that led the way.
Very good opening for context.
Less than 20 years after the end of the Civil War, freed blacks in the South were subjected to a series of laws that legally separated the races in order to maintain white supremacy. Known as Jim Crow laws, they established the doctrine of separate but equal, and effectively created two separate and unequal societies, one for whites, the other for blacks.
All right, so make sure you wear that right. Remember, Jim Crow laws segregated blacks primarily in the South from whites. Also, too, you might want to write down, if you don't remember this already, remember the case of Plessy, Plessy, versus Ferguson, Ferguson. Plessy, once again, Plessy. May have an extra E in there, but anyway, you're close enough. Plessy versus Ferguson, a Louisiana case in which it said, and this is another important thing to make sure you write down, as long as the facilities are equal, they can be separate. So this is where we get the doctrine of separate but equal. That goes back to an 1890 Supreme Court case. Now we're going to look at see how things weren't really quite so equal.
Buses, restaurants, hotels, restrooms, even drinking fountains were segregated by race. One of the most devastating of these segregation laws created separate schools for blacks and whites in many states. Inadequate funding and poor conditions made black public schools invariably inferior to white public schools.
Okay, so obviously less funding, the facilities, like I remember a young girl talking that when she got to college and she was in a science class, she couldn't use a microscope. Why? She'd never had a microscope in her science classes in her black school. So they didn't have all the facilities. They didn't have the equipment. They tended to have hand-me-down books. And of course, they had black teachers as well who had not gone to schools that were equal as well. So, you know, in some cases, though they were hardworking and devoted, their teachers might not have been as good as well.
The white schools were getting the benefits of the taxes of the community. And they were much better funded than black schools. Black schools lacked equipment, they lacked good fields, they lacked new textbooks. The teachers were paid less, principals were paid less, and in general, the facilities were a lot poorer than in white schools.
It wasn't until 1954 that the Supreme Court outlawed legal segregation in schools through the landmark Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka decision, which stated that separate could never be equal, and marked an important civil rights victory. Yet public areas remain separate.
Okay, so remember Brown, as in the color brown, versus Board. If you just remember Brown versus Board, that's good enough. It was a Kansas case, and it said separate was inherently unequal. So it overturns Plessy versus Ferguson. But just because the Supreme Court says it's unconstitutional didn't mean things got fixed. The next case they're going to talk about, well, they're going to eventually, I hope, talk about, if not, I will, talk about Little Rock.
In many southern states. The Brown decision encouraged many African Americans in the South to challenge segregation laws in their own way. In 1955, a black woman named Rosa Parks was arrested after she refused to move to the black section in the back of a public bus in Montgomery, Alabama. This led to a massive boycott, as 17,000 blacks refused to ride the city buses. A year after the boycott began, a federal court struck down Alabama's law segregating public transportation. In January 19...
Okay, so remember Rosa Parks? What the heck's wrong? Anyway, in 1955, Rosa Parks, you know the story, refused to give up her seat. She was arrested. That inspires a boycott. The boycott brought a lot of attention to the case, but it ultimately took the Supreme Court to knock down this idea that you could segregate people on the same bus, at least for inner city buses. Now, and of course, it's going to make famous a man by the name of Martin Luther King. King is going to become famous as a result.
1957, black ministers from across the South met in Atlanta, Georgia. Together, they founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, and elected Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as president.
Okay, so Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. MLK was the leader. Now, sometimes AP, not so much STAR, but sometimes AP will expect you guys to kind of note some of the different groups. Like there's going to be a group called SNCC. There's going to be a group called CORE. Different African-American groups. They not all followed Dr. King, y'all. Some were primarily students. Some believed in nonviolent methods. Some believed in direct confrontation. Some even came to believe in violence. King, of course, rejected the violence part. And then we're going to come to...
A passionate and moving speaker, Dr. King would emerge as the leader of the early civil rights movement.
We're going to stand up right here in Alabama.
King committed the organization to gaining civil rights for African Americans through nonviolent protests and civil disobedience.
Break the law if it's unjust, go to jail, overwhelm the jails.
Made it clear they would resist desegregation. And in 1957, President Dwight Eisenhower had to use federal troops to enforce a federal court order to desegregate the high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. Still,
okay, now very famous scene here of Elizabeth Eckford's here. You don't need to necessarily know her name. She's still alive today, by the way. So what happened in Little Rock, Arkansas? Well, STAR does expect you guys to know the name of the governor. It is a STAR requirement. His name was Faubus, F-A-U-B-U-S, F-A-U-B-U-S. Now, because of Brown, the school board in Little Rock, Arkansas had made the decision to begin very slowly integrating the schools. 9 very talented, very good students, great attendance, and behavior records were picked. Because the last thing you want, right, is to pick some kid who's going to cause problems, and everybody's like, see what happened? Look at these. So they really brought great kids. Any school should have been thrilled to death to have these kids. All right, so the school is going to do it, but then the governor steps in and says, we ain't going to do this. And he used a technique, y'all, that sadly the governor of Mississippi and Alabama would do, and that was to make a lot of political, to get a lot of political support. In some cases, to distract from things that were going on that maybe people weren't too thrilled about in the state. So by focusing on this desegregation issue, which today we might call a wedge issue, one that would really push people apart, he ordered the National Guard, which is under his control, to keep the 9 black kids out of there. Liz didn't get the message that they had canceled the kids going to school that day. So Elizabeth here, she showed up and she got, not physically assaulted, but mentally assaulted. She got spit upon and was not admitted. Now, Eisenhower, and I mentioned this, I think last time, civil rights was not Eisenhower's big thing. First, one thing, y'all, he lived outside the country a lot of his life. He was from a town in Kansas. He hardly saw black people where he lived. So he really had no idea what a lot of them were going through. And yet, y'all, when he saw a governor, basically, ignore the Supreme Court of the United States of America, he decided, I have to act. I have to be pushed. I have to do this. Much like, I hate to say, but Kennedy, to a lesser extent, is going to kind of have to respond. Not lead, but respond in some cases in civil rights. So Eisenhower, y'all, he deputizes, or he takes over the National Guard, but he also sends American troops, the 101st Airborne, to make sure that those 9 kids go. Those kids went to school that year, y'all. One of them that was a senior graduated, but they had to have soldiers with them everywhere. That girl, Elizabeth, would have had an armed, they didn't have bullets in it, but had a guy sitting there, y'all, with an M1 rifle in her class. But as she has said, they were protected, but when the girls went into the restrooms alone, when they went into the rooms to change clothes, like for PE, that's when they got a lot of grief. One of the girls got kicked out for dumping some chili on top of a guy's head who'd been calling her the N-word and making fun of her. The kid didn't get in trouble, but she got kicked out.
It was clear that the winds of change were beginning to blow across the South. Vowing to follow Dr. King's call for nonviolence, 4 African-American college freshmen sat down at a whites-only lunch counter on February 1st, 1960.
And this is one of the first sit-downs. 4 students sat down at Woolsworth.
The first sit-ins, a peaceful expression of their growing dissatisfaction with the slow pace of desegregation. The sit-in movement spread quickly to other southern cities, and most blacks remained committed to Dr. King's nonviolent tactics, even in the face of foul language, beatings, and arrests.
People dump stuff on their heads.
The police would use billy clubs and cattle prods, electric cattle prods that you would use on big animals to jab people. Not to respond to that, it takes an awful lot of discipline and it takes an awful lot of courage.
On May 4th, 1961, a group of black and white protesters boarded 2 buses traveling from Washington, D.C.
Now, this is under President Kennedy.
Their goal was to integrate bus terminals on their ride through Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi.
So they're trying to integrate the buses.
Freedom Riders.
In other words, blacks and whites could sit next to each other.
Klan slashed tires and firebombed the buses. Freedom Riders were beaten. Many were arrested.
We Shall Overcome, one of the major themes and songs.
What happened to the first few Freedom Riders, however, only seemed to encourage more protesters. It grew into a multiracial force of 1,000 and gave the movement important publicity. This helped force the Kennedy administration to order the Interstate Commerce Commission to stop segregation in interstate bus travel. During the early 1960s, Birmingham, Alabama gained a reputation for extreme violence against
Make sure you remember Birmingham.
Organized for civil rights and tried to cross the color line. In April 1963, in jail after being arrested for leading an unauthorized protest march on the Birmingham City Hall, Dr. King wrote what became known as his Letter from a Birmingham Jail.
Okay, make sure you guys write that down. That's on STAR. You very likely could see it on an AP test as well as a document. This is from Dr. King, a letter from the Birmingham jail. Now, after being arrested for a protest, he was put into, he was put into jail, and a lot of ministers, so particularly several white ministers, had written him saying, look, we're trying to make changes, but you're not helping things. You're slowing us. You're going too fast. You need to slow down here. And so what Dr. King writes in this letter is, look, we've waited a long time already. It is time. We need to make these changes. And in the letter from Birmingham jail, y'all, he explains his theory of civil disobedience. And remember, y'all, it goes back to Gandhi. That's good for complexity purposes, right? Gandhi in India, his method of making the British leave India by nonviolent protest, by not cooperating, by using boycotts, methods like that had worked against the British in India. But it even goes back further, y'all, to during the Mexican War, right? When Henry David Thoreau, okay, remember Henry David Thoreau got Thoreau'd in jail because he wouldn't pay taxes that would support the Mexican War. Remember, Thoreau believed that the Mexican War was all about getting land for slavery purposes, and he didn't want his taxes to support slavery, all right? As a transcendentalist, he believed that was about as bad a thing as you could do to people was to enslave them, their minds and their bodies. And so he opposed it. And while he was there, he wrote an essay on civil disobedience. It is that the ideas of the civil disobedience that he did that Dr. King would later use, along with Gandhi's ideas, and then, of course, his own modifications to lead the civil rights movement for African Americans, and other groups would copy that.
Saying, for years, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with a piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over, and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair. The protest continued. Led by the SCLC, a group of children gathered in Birmingham on May 2nd, 1963, for a peaceful demonstration protesting segregation. Within 3 hours, close to 1,000 children were jailed. The next day, more children demonstrated. Police ordered firefighters to use hoses to disperse them and mobilized dog units to attack them. That night, national news programs broadcast footage of white officials brutalizing black children. The nation was shocked and horrified. A few weeks later, President Kennedy appeared on television announcing that he would send Congress the most sweeping civil rights bill since the end of the Civil War.
The events in Birmingham. All right, now they're skipping a couple of important events here that I usually spend some real time on that they didn't do so here. All right, so you see the Birmingham thing, right? Most of the adults were in jail. They no longer had money for bail to get out of jail. They had to pay apartment or house, payments and stuff like that. So the decision was made to have a children's crusade, to use the children. And so these children didn't go to school. They marched that day. They gathered at a church. It will be important to remember for later, the 16th Street Baptist Church. And they went out there, and the director of public safety, essentially police chief, Bull O'Connor, went way overboard. He ended up using fire hoses on these kids. You saw the dogs used against these kids, and film was made of that. And that film was broadcast around the country. And for the first time, a lot of people, kind of like, how Uncle Tom's Cabin let people know how bad slavery was in ways they had never heard. That film of those that you saw there with the fire hoses and the dog changed a lot of people's minds. Okay. Now, what they also skipped, though, was the governor of Alabama. His name was George Wallace. George Wallace, Wallace, Wallace. George Wallace, y'all, decided that he would not let his school in Alabama, his university, the University of Alabama, be desegregated. Now, a few months before, President Kennedy had supported a black man by the name of, I just went blank, oh my gosh, had supported the first black man to go to James Meredith, it came to me. James Meredith to go to the University of Mississippi. That man was admitted, but there were riots, people died, and it was a mess. So when the decision was made to send a black man, Jimmy Hood, and a black woman, Vivian Malone, to go to the University of Alabama, George Wallace says, no, I'm not going to do it. So he stands in the schoolroom door, right? And he makes a speech. They show up, the attorney general, and says, these students are here to be admitted. Wallace says, nope, none shall pass. No one's going to get in here. And he gives a speech saying this is a states' rights issue. He didn't say it's racism, it's states' rights. The federal government is telling us who we have to put in our school. Education is primarily for the state to deal with. Kennedy this time was prepared for it. Kennedy, y'all, was a quick learner. And so like Eisenhower had used the National Guard and Army, Kennedy takes over the Army. He nationalizes or federalizes the Army, and he orders that Wallace leave. Wallace leaves, and the two students are admitted. So that was Wallace's stand in the courthouse door. What they don't mention either is a very important to me civil rights leader, Medgar Evers, was assassinated the same night that Kennedy, or within a day of Kennedy giving the speech. Medgar Evers, incredibly brave man. I've been to the house where he died. He was shot and killed right in front of his family, and he had championed a lot of issues there. Very brave man.
And elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them.
To push Congress into taking action on the bill, a group of civil rights leaders called for a march on Washington. On August 28th,
so they're there to put pressure on Congress to pass it.
200,000 people, black and white, from all over the country and from all walks of life, joined together in Washington to protest violence and discrimination in the South. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered the closing remarks, an address that came to be called the I Have a Dream speech.
I have a dream. One day, this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. Behold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
In November 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, with his civil rights bill still being debated in the House of Representatives. His death was a blow to the movement, but his successor, Lyndon Johnson, took up the cause and pressured the Congress to pass what became known as the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This measure outlawed racial discrimination in public accommodations and in the workplace, and tried to break down barriers to black voters in the Deep South.
All right, so remember, Kennedy's assassinated, and much like, I was jokingly saying in the space race that Kennedy, died so that we could get to the moon. Obviously, that's not true, but they used his name. Kennedy, y'all, much as I love the guy, could not get these bills passed. Even with the March on Washington, they could not get the bills passed. But when Kennedy died, a Southerner, Lyndon Johnson, his vice president, became president. And Johnson was much better at getting a bill through. And Johnson, y'all, used Kennedy's memory a lot. Kind of a, once again, this we need to do for the president. Our president died trying to get this done. So the Civil Rights Act, y'all, makes it a law what the courts had said before. You can't discriminate against people in public places, right? And they even included not just race, but they included gender, national origin, religion, a lot of other things. Almost everybody thinks, oh, this was just the black civil rights bill. No. It would be used for all kinds of other groups of people as well, too. No longer could you publicly discriminate against people for jobs, for education, in public places, swimming pools, businesses, or whatever.
The summer of 1964 became known as Mississippi Freedom Summer, as a diverse group of civil rights advocates tried to register black voters in Mississippi. Many whites in the state strongly resisted the effort Some even resorted to violence, killing 3 young civil rights workers. In February 1965, a small voting rights march in Selma, Alabama erupted in violence and ended in the death of a black activist. Outraged, civil rights advocates held another march on Sunday, March 7th. In an effort to stop the marchers, Governor George Wallace sent 200 state troopers armed with tear gas, nightsticks, and bullwhips. The violence was so severe that the event became known as Bloody Sunday. 2 weeks later, Martin Luther King Jr. organized another march from Selma to Montgomery. This time, though, President Johnson ordered National Guardsmen, Army troops, FBI agents, and U.S. Marshals to protect the marchers. At the end of the march, 25,000 people gathered on the steps of the Alabama State Capitol to call for an end to voter discrimination. Later in 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. The legislation was designed to fight the persistent discrimination in voting in southern states. Results came quickly. In 1964, only 23% of eligible African American voters were registered in the South. By 1969, the number had almost tripled to 61%.
All right, so some things about that. We did the Civil Rights Act. The Mississippi Freedom Summer. Now, Mississippi was considered the most racist of the states. The old joke was, what has 4 eyes and yet cannot see? Mississippi, right? And there were an attempt to educate African Americans there about their history, to get them registered to vote, trying to get them to vote for more liberal Democrats, because a lot of your white Southern Democrats, y'all, were very, very conservative and were very supportive of segregation. So the idea was to vote for this new sort of Mississippi Democratic Party. So they sent workers down south to try to register blacks to vote. And 3 of these students, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodwin, 2 white guys and 1 black guy, were picked up by folks, and they were beaten and shot and buried in a earthen dam that was being built during this time. And we didn't actually convict anybody, y'all, till just a handful of years ago. The courts, y'all, tended to not convict a lot of these people, and when the evidence was against them. So you see Selma, Alabama, after an African-American man was murdered, they decided to have a march that went over the Edward Pettus Bridge. That's Pettus, the Edward Pettus Bridge. And as you saw, Governor Wallace's police forces met them, beat up a lot of them, used, horses and stuff on some of these folks, tear gas, and this was known as Bloody Sunday. So King did not obviously finish this march. But then a few weeks later, with the protection of the U.S. government, they did march over that bridge, and they did march from Selma to Montgomery to the Capitol. It is the Selma March, as well as the murder of those civil rights workers in Mississippi, that lead to President Johnson getting the Voting Rights Act passed. This act, y'all, basically gave the government, the federal government, the ability to make sure that African Americans, even though technically, legally, they could be able to vote, that they could vote in fact. Removing things like the poll tax, which made you pay money before being able to vote. Also getting rid of grandfather clauses, getting rid of the literacy test, which had been used to keep a lot of people from voting. And so finally, African Americans had the ability, legally, in de facto, to be able to vote, not just legally, but in fact.
Even though segregation laws had ended and African Americans had won the right to vote throughout the South, economic and social discrimination against blacks continued. In contrast to the nonviolent tactics of Martin Luther King Jr., support began to build in parts of the black community for more forceful measures to promote change. Malcolm X, a Muslim minister and member of the Nation of Islam, came to be the most vocal spokesman for this movement. His slogan, "By any means necessary," illustrated how strongly he opposed
By any means necessary.
nonviolent approach to civil rights. Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam also opposed the concept of racial integration.
Has integration solved the problem or made it worse? When you integrate a white community seeking better housing, history here during the past 10 years has proven that the whites cut out. They flee to the suburbs.
White
And the
flight.
community that you thought you were integrating soon becomes another all-black slum.
Malcolm X was assassinated by rival members of the Nation of Islam on February 21st, 1965. But his ideas formed the basis for a new generation of black leaders who had become frustrated with the nonviolent tactics of Dr. King. One such group started in Oakland, California, called themselves the Black Panthers.
The Black Panthers saw themselves as one of the many revolutionary parties in the United States that was willing to challenge the economic structure. Their style of presentation, with afros, with black berets, with black leather jackets, with their leadership in Oakland originally carrying weapons openly, certainly that image presented an image of danger to the American public.
The radicalism of the Black Panthers expressed the anger and frustration felt by many African Americans facing persistent discrimination in housing, education, and employment, particularly in urban areas. From 1965 to 1967, that frustration exploded in race riots across the country. Some of the most serious riots were in the Watts district of Los Angeles, Newark, New Jersey, and Detroit, Michigan, where many people were killed and thousands injured. On April 4th, 1968, a devastating blow was dealt to the civil rights movement. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated by a sniper outside his motel room in Memphis, Tennessee.
Police have issued an all-points bulletin for a well-dressed young white man seen running from the scene.
Shock and outrage at King's murder sparked riots in more than 130 cities.
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there.
A few months later, on June 5th, 1968, presidential candidate and former Attorney General Robert Kennedy was murdered. His assassination came just after winning the California presidential primary with a campaign that pledged to bring the races together. The deaths of King and Kennedy in 1968 marked a dramatic loss of leadership for the civil rights movement. The African American struggle for justice, however, had lit a fire under other minorities who now began to push for their civil rights.
All right. So, let's see here. Malcolm X. AP likes to often have you guys contrast and compare Malcolm X and his ideas and methods with those of MLK, right? Now, Malcolm X was a member of the Nation of Islam. Much like Marcus Garvey of the 1920s, in fact, his father had been a follower of Marcus Garvey. They believed in segregation. Remember, King wanted people to move together. He welcomed white people helping the cause. Whereas Malcolm X, at least initially, y'all, rejected any help from people he sometimes called white devils. King, remember, y'all, believed in nonviolence. You might provoke violence against you, but that was purely to try to help the cause. You didn't do violence yourself. And that was hard to do sometimes, y'all, because one of the things I didn't mention was in Birmingham, the same place where you saw the dogs attacking. After King gave his speech, his I Have a Dream speech, a man or men had thrown a bomb into a church and killed 4 young black girls, 4 little girls who were getting ready for Sunday school, had killed them. And that was shocking. And a lot of people wanted to strike back. They said, now we can't keep turning the other cheek. But King still urged people to not fight back. Whereas Malcolm X, y'all, he believed, as it said, by any means necessary. If it takes violence, use violence. But when Malcolm ultimately left the Nation of Islam and began working on his own and talking about whites maybe working together, maybe not encouraging violence, he himself was killed by members of that group, the Nation of Islam. Make sure you guys know the Black Panthers. They were particularly important out on the West Coast in Oakland and in LA and places like that. One of the groups, y'all, that had started out as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, changes and becomes the Student National Coordinating Committee. And for the first time, they started advocating the clenched fist and saying the words Black Power. And, Malcolm had been assassinated back in 64 or 65. These guys kind of pick up from him. They openly carried weapons, and particularly, y'all, they were formed as a result of violence by police against African Americans. And so they decided to arm themselves. And of course, like they mentioned, their style, the cool berets and all of that. But they also set up schools to teach kids about Black history. They set up places to feed people. So they had a multiple kind of strategy, multiple pronged strategy. And then, of course, you saw Dr. King get assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. By this point, both he and the man assassinated a couple months later, Robert Kennedy, the brother of the slain president, who was running for president himself, were opposing the Vietnam War. And both of them ended up being assassinated.
In the 1960s, many Latinos living on the West Coast were farm workers. Many farm owners exploited these workers by routinely ignoring state laws regarding working standards. In 1962, led by the dynamic Cesar Chavez, the National Farm Workers Association, NFWA,
National Farm Workers Association.
Working conditions. Like Dr. King, Chavez employed nonviolent tactics to achieve his goals. In 1965, the NFWA, later to become the United Farm Workers, began a strike against grape growers in California. Chavez and the NFWA also organized a successful consumer boycott of grapes that were not picked by unionized labor. By 1970, most grape growers had agreed to contracts with the farm workers. Later, California Governor Jerry Brown signed a bill, the 1975 Agricultural Labor Relations Act, that established collective bargaining laws for farm workers. While the battle for civil rights has been fought by many groups of people, it is ironic that those native to America have been consistently denied opportunity here. In 1968, inspired by militant Black groups, young Native Americans formed the American Indian Movement, or AIM, which called for political action and cultural profit. In 1969, members of AIM seized Alcatraz Island, an unoccupied federal penitentiary in San Francisco Bay, holding it for 19 months to publicize the plight of Native Americans. In an effort to call attention to what they considered centuries of betrayal and deceit, AIM led the Trail of Broken Treaties March on Washington in 1972. They demanded proper health care, housing, employment, economic development, and education for all Indian people. In 1973, armed members of AIM and other Native Americans occupied the town of Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation of South Dakota, site of an infamous massacre of Indians by federal troops in 1890. The intent was to publicize the terrible conditions in which the Sioux people lived, but events got out of control when the armed protesters clashed with FBI agents during the 71-day siege, and 2 AIM members were killed. The militant pressure did result in some minor change. The government returned 48,000 acres of sacred lands to the Taos Pueblo of New Mexico. The Nixon administration targeted minority aid programs for Native Americans living in cities, and Congress added money in the Indian Education Act of 1972.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about Hispanics, particularly here. The National Farm Workers Group. Now, a lot of people of Hispanic background, mainly Mexican, and on the West Coast had been, there as migrants working, particularly in farm areas. Conditions could be awful, y'all. I mean, just access to bathrooms and pay and decent living conditions. And Cesar Chavez became the leader of these groups, and he did use some of the same techniques, protest and things, but he added some other dimensions. One of them was the fast, the hunger fast. Much as Gandhi had gone on hunger strikes to protest, he himself would go on to strikes, nearly dying in a couple of cases. So he used the hunger fast. He also used the boycott. If you don't like how these workers are being treated, don't buy from companies that treat them this way. And particularly, he targeted the grape business, right? And for a long time, unless you knew, that the grape company that was supplying the grapes was one of those that made a deal with the farm workers, people wouldn't buy them. And eventually, it was successful. AIM stood for the American Indian Movement, of course, trying to draw attention to the plight of Native Americans in this country. And one of the things that they did in the late 60s was to take over and hold the island of Alcatraz out in the middle of San Francisco Bay. They jokingly said they would sell it back for the same price that the Dutch had bought Manhattan Island. And this, of course, got them a lot of publicity as well, too. They mentioned, but there's no question on it, about Wounded Knee from 1973. I was 10 years old. I definitely remember this issue. There'd been an issue between two different groups of tribal governments, and eventually an armed group took over, and the government surrounded them, y'all. I remember seeing little armored personnel carriers driving around there, and for I think 70 days or something that this went on. And eventually it ended relatively peacefully. But the result was some land was giving back, but to Taos Indians, but the government did do more to spend money on education and on health. Nevertheless, y'all, as a person of some, I have some minor Indian blood in my background. It's really sad to see the condition that a lot of these Indians labor under today, that they live under on the reservations. And it's an issue our nation is still wrestling with, but these people brought some attention. Now we're going to look at Asian American rights, and I will add some more to this.
Asian Americans also pushed for federal help in overcoming problems related to inadequate health care and overcoming language barriers, as well as economic reforms, equal pay for equal work. When Hawaii became a state in 1959, Asian Americans were ensured greater political representation in the U.S. Congress. Since the late 40s, many Japanese Americans had sought justice for being forced by the U.S. government to live in internment camps during World War II. Although the government paid some monies under the Japanese American Evacuation Claims Act of 1948, it was not until 1988 that the United States government formally apologized and provided more substantial payments as compensation to the displaced Japanese Americans.
Okay, now, so Hawaii comes in. Obviously, Hawaii has a much larger Asian population. This is a chance for more Asian Americans to become congressmen, congresswomen, senators, and that as well, too. Gives them some clout. You guys remember, too, going back, way back, there had been a case where the Supreme Court had basically ruled that Asians were not allowed to even necessarily be citizens in a famous case back in the 1880s, 1890s. They'd been discriminated against as Chinese workers, remember, who came here to work to look for gold in California. A lot of them had helped build the railroads, but they had been treated as second-class citizens in lots and lots of ways. Probably the worst part came during World War II, when in the hysteria following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans on the West Coast, although ironically not in Hawaii, those on the West Coast, California predominantly, were moved into the interior and put into internment camps. A lot of them had to sell their businesses overnight. They could only take a couple of suitcases with them, and to sell their houses, often at a loss. And here they were guarded and kept for 3 years of the war. Some of them volunteered to go fight against against the Germans and against the Italians. In fact, the most successful, most medaled group in our military were Japanese American soldiers who fought in Italy. Now, one that is not mentioned here that comes later, y'all, in the 1970s was the story of David Chin. David Chin, C-H-I-N. David Chin was an Asian American living up, I believe, in Detroit. Now, in the 1970s, a lot of American car companies began to struggle because of the imports of Japanese cars, right? And of course, a lot of Americans, I hate to say, aren't too bright about distinguishing different groups of people. And David Chin was at a pool hall, I think it was in Detroit, and basically he was beaten to death by a guy who got away with it for basically a slap on his wrist. Why did the guy do this? He was mad that he'd lost a job in the car business making cars, and he blamed it on a Chinese guy. This really awakened a lot of Asian Americans to fight that they be treated equally, that, you know, when they were beaten or hurt, that they too got equal justice and not, you know, a slap on the wrist for the perpetrator as the guys did. I think they ended up doing a couple, maybe at the most a couple years in prison for beating this young man to death. And that awakened a lot of Asian Americans as well. And then, of course, y'all, the United States sees a large influx of Asian Americans at the end of the Vietnam War, right? At the end of the Vietnam War, we get several waves of people that come here. Dobie particularly has been impacted for whatever reason. A lot of people settled in this area. And, you know, when I was a student over in Pasadena High School, we had virtually no Asians in our class. And I don't mean just, you know, East Asians, no South Asians, no Pacific Islanders. It was very white and very Hispanic. But Dobie, even back then in the 70s, had a large Asian population. And of course, there have been other waves that have continued. So today, we have a much more diverse Asian population than we did. Primarily before, it was Chinese who'd come over to work for gold or to work on the work here. We also had Japanese who'd come here to work in the fields. Mainly, at first, they started off working as farm workers, and Filipinos, particularly in a lot of the service industries as well too.
Issues of equality were not limited to race and ethnicity. The movement for civil rights also had a major impact on women. Women joined the industrial workforce in great numbers during World War II, enjoying a new measure of economic independence and job satisfaction. But many left the workforce at the war's end, as returning soldiers reclaimed their factory jobs. In 1963, Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, pointed out the plight of the so-called housewife, verbalizing the dissatisfaction of many women. Passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, however, would help change that. Title VII of that law prohibits employment discrimination based on race,
Title VII,
religion, sex, and national origin. By forbidding discrimination by gender, Title VII will become one of the cornerstones of the women's movement. In 1966, Friedan and 27 other women founded NOW, the National Organization for Women, to help achieve their goals. NOW's aim was to take action, to bring about equality for all women. Equal job opportunities, along with equal pay, were at the top of their list. NOW pointed out that for every dollar a man made, a woman woman made 59 cents for the same job. Now also focused on the value of women's work inside a home, they popularized the slogan, "Every mother is a working mother." Using Title VII as leverage, women began entering the labor force in swelling numbers at nearly every level of employment. Women also began earning college degrees in rapidly increasing numbers.
Nowadays, the entry classes of law school classes are about 50% women. And in medical schools, the entrance classes at least, are 30 to 40% women. This is a big change.
It's higher now. It's like 20 years old.
The opportunities available to women.
Now and other women's groups also work to secure reproductive freedom by calling for the repeal of existing anti-abortion laws. In 1973, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that such laws were unconstitutional in Roe v. Wade. This landmark decision severely limited state abortion laws and effectively legalized abortion in the U.S. Many women participated in a campaign for an equal rights amendment to the Constitution, which stated that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. The ERA made it through Congress, but did not get the required approval from 3/4 of the state legislatures to become an amendment. Sex discrimination was not only a women's issue. Homosexuals protested discrimination based on sexual orientation, demanding the same legal protections as heterosexuals.
That's Houston right there, y'all.
Although many activists have been effective in the fight to end discriminatory practices, gay rights remain a divisive social and political issue. Like other groups, rights for the disabled have often been overlooked. Even today, people with disabilities continue to press for equal opportunities to participate fully in American society. The 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act represented the single most sweeping civil rights legislation since the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The bill banned discrimination in the hiring, promoting, and firing of persons with disabilities. In the space of 40 years, the civil rights movement made important gains. Legal segregation came to an end. Discriminatory practices in housing and the workplace were outlawed, and the concept of equal rights began to expand beyond groups defined by race. In 1965, the federal government, in an attempt to make up for past discrimination, introduced affirmative action. The policy encouraged the inclusion of minorities in hiring, college admissions, and the awarding of government contracts. Affirmative action helped diversify jobs, unions, police and fire departments, and college campuses across the country. Nevertheless, many groups continue to strive for equality in America.
It's fashionable to say, well, the more things change, the more they stay the same, and we really haven't made as much progress as we needed to make. Absolutely right. This country is not yet equal, but an enormous change has occurred.
The people are diverse, but the goal is the same: to create one out of many, one body of individuals with equal protection under the law. As a result of the civil rights movements during the latter half of the 20th century, America has moved closer to the pledge of one nation with liberty and justice for all.
All right. Okay, you don't need to see it again. You get the idea there. All right. So some basics of this, right? So in 1963, the year that I was born, Betty Friedan wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. This is so incredibly important if you're talking about the women's movement. She really talked about how the housewife and she has this really memorable part where the housewife does all this stuff. She's cleaning, she's bathing kids, she's cooking, and she starts reflecting and she says, is this it? Is this all there is? It was a problem where women wanted more fulfillment than that. And that book became a big bestseller. It awakened a lot of women to their plight and to their situation. And remember, in 1964, Part 7 of the Civil Rights Act, as I said earlier, did include women. In fact, there's a story that some people, to keep the Civil Rights Bill from passing, put the part in there about women, thinking there was no way that it would pass, what we call a poison pill. We'll put something in the bill so obnoxious that people will not vote for all the good part of it because of this one thing. Well, it didn't work, obviously, and women were also included in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, Betty Friedan formed an organization called NOW. It still exists today. All right. The National Organization of Women. And of course, it wanted, of course, women to have equal rights in hiring and things. And you got to remember, y'all, I mean, I'm old enough to remember seeing ads in the newspaper that would say things like they had separate sections. There was a men wanted for jobs and a women's wanted for jobs. And in some of the women's ads, y'all, it would say, for example, must be attractive, must be pretty, must be single. They could get away with that kind of stuff. Flight stewardesses, y'all, and they were stewardesses. There weren't men. You weren't flight attendants like we call them today. But stewardesses were expected to not be married, to be attractive. And if they got overweight, y'all, they would put them at a separate table at the restaurants when they were flying around town. They called it the piggy table until they could lose weight. They were expected not necessarily to make themselves available to the men traveling in business class, but to look like they might be. Because if they're married and they got that wedding ring, that's going to stop, quote, the fantasy of the guy like, ooh, maybe I can pick up the stewardess. That's kind of how they were. And there was even an ad that said, we really move our tails for you. And it featured stewardesses in really kind of tight, short dresses. That's kind of how a lot of these women were viewed. Now, in 1968, in New Jersey, in Atlantic City, they had the Miss America pageant, right? We still do, right? The Miss America pageant. A lot of your women's advocates were angry and thought that women were seen basically for their looks, for their bodies, not for their minds, and were very upset with this competition. And they're still controversial among a lot of your feminists. And some of these women, y'all, in their anger, they had bras, right? And they took these bras and they put them in a trash can. They also got copies of Playboy magazine and threw it in the trash can. And they intended to light it, basically saying these were, like signs of the male patriarchy, the signs of males controlling them. Well, they didn't have matches, or they couldn't get it on fire, or whatever. But because of that one incident, many of your anti-feminist men would call these women bra burners. I remember hearing that from my mind. Is she a bra burner? Is she one of those, right? And instead they picked, I think, what did they use? Did they have a pig? Or they nominated somebody else to be Miss America, basically saying, look, they're treating these women like animals. Now, you see about the issue of money and equal pay. Now, Roe versus Wade is on your STAR test. It's out, definitely something you need to know for AP as well, too. The case began in Texas. Wade was one of our district attorneys in Dallas. A lot of states, y'all, particularly in the South, had laws making it illegal to get an abortion. Now, some women went ahead and got them illegally. Sometimes they tried to induce them themselves. It could be quite dangerous, and the women died as a result of these, especially unsanitary, type of things done that way. Now, this woman, and her name wasn't Roe, that was a pseudonym that was used. She took the case, and ultimately it reached the Supreme Court. And in the case, the Supreme Court said not necessarily that abortion was legal, but it said there was no reason legally that a state could ban an abortion in the first trimester. The first trimester obviously means the first 3 months. So states might be free to ban abortions in the 4th or 6th month or whatever, but legally, if a woman was wanted an abortion in the first 3 months, that could not be prohibited. And that was seen as a great victory among a lot of women. Of course, also too, y'all, the availability of the pill, the birth control pill in the early 1960s puts more control in women's hands about whether they want to or not have children. The Equal Rights Amendment is considered a big defeat for women. It went way back to Alice Paul. After women got the right to vote with the 19th Amendment, many women, y'all, felt like, okay, that's it, cool, we can vote. That's all we need. But you had other women saying, no, 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 that's just the first step. We need to do more. We need an amendment to the Constitution saying that women will be treated equally, right? Now, this equal amendment bill stayed on the books, and a lot of states went ahead and voted for it, but it needed 3/4 of all the states to do so. It was getting close, and an extension was given to try to make it get by, but there were a lot of people opposed to it. One that you guys need to know for STAR purposes. Make sure you know a woman by the name of Phyllis Schlafly. Phyllis Schlafly, Phyllis, Phyllis, and then Schlafly, Schalfy, Phyllis Schlafly. She was a conservative woman who was very opposed to this Equal Rights Amendment. Among other things, she said, well, if we have this, they're going to start drafting women to be in the military. If we have this, there's going to be women and men using the same bathrooms. And she believed that it would have a big impact on marriages and particularly on families. And her ideas appealed to enough people that the last couple of states needed to take it over to 3/4 and make it an amendment, did not pass it. And the equal rights failed to pass. And to many women, that is still the biggest loss for the feminist movement. Now, what other group fought for equality in the area of sexuality? That would be gays, people, homosexuals. And particularly, y'all, when this comes up is in 1969. Now, I remember the day, y'all. I was a kid, in first grade, and we were living in Mississippi, and we were at the post office. Now, in those days, probably not a good idea, but my mom left me in the car. I'm 6 years old? She leaves me in the car while she goes into the post office. One time I disengaged the brake and rolled out the doggone car. But anyway, I'm sitting there, I'm listening to the radio, and it announces that Judy Garland, the woman who played, as a little girl, played Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, had passed away. Turns out, sad story, she was a drug addict, and it was all really, really sad. I didn't know that. But the thing is, y'all, Judy Garland, this woman, had been a big supporter and a hero to gay Americans. I, of course, had no idea about that. I didn't know what gay meant when I was that age. But what happened was that night up in New York, a group of a group of gay Americans got together at a gay bar, right? And in this bar, the cops came and showed up, and it beat up a lot of these guys, took them to jail. And this moment, on the night that Judy Garland died, became for a lot of groups like, hey, we need to start fighting for our rights. And of course, today, people whose sexual orientation is gay, a lot of them, they now can marry in a lot of states, for example. They're entitled, their spouses, their partners are entitled to a lot of the same treatment and the same benefits as people who are married, even if they are not allowed to do that. And pretty much in any state now, they can get married. And so the next thing is affirmative action. Make sure you're aware of that. The idea is to try to make up for past discrimination by giving some groups that have been historically discriminated against, be that women, blacks, or other minorities, give them preferential hiring, give them preferential treatment in admission to schools, right? And this is, of course, a controversial issue that is probably going to go to the Supreme Court. Asian Americans particularly have felt really kind of stung by this. Asian Americans are often very, very successful. much higher, for example, in test scores and things like that. And in some schools, they have limited the number of Asians that can be there, you know, and as a result, some Asians find themselves making higher scores than whites, blacks, Hispanics, and others, and yet not being admitted to the school. And understandably, a lot of Asians are upset about that. But the idea was to redress the problems. Ironically, Asians had never been any of them that had caused any of these problems. And that's why particularly a lot of Asian Americans are understandably upset. And that's coming before the court. It'll be interesting to see. So this is called affirmative action. We're acting to try to make up for past discrimination against African Americans, against Hispanics, women, by giving them preferential hiring, admission to things. Now, jump ahead a few years, and this is another case that you need to know. Write it down. It's on the star as well. It's called Bakke versus Board of Regents. Bakke, B-A-K-K-E, B-A-K-K-E versus Board of Regents. Now, Bakke was a white man, very qualified, who wanted to go to this particular medical school. But instead, it was University of California, I think. He wanted to go to this college and be a doctor. Well, he was turned down a couple of times. But when they checked it out, it turned out his qualifications were higher than those of the person that replaced him. And so he sued, talking about what was called reverse discrimination. You know, that it is wrong to fight discrimination of the past by discriminating against people now, right? For things that they never did. You know, Bakke didn't keep anybody out of school. You know, he's just trying to get into medical school. You know, maybe his dad or granddad had kept somebody out, but it wasn't him. And so this raised the issue of reverse discrimination. And to this day, the court still really wrestles with that. You know, can you only use race to say that somebody gets the job or gets the college admission and somebody else doesn't get it? Not really. But what it can be is considered part of it, right? They can look at that as a factor, but it can't be purely this or that. And that's kind of where the court is now, okay, that they've had to wrestle with. But it's a difficult issue, and of course, one that we still have a ways to go. All right.